أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فوضوا أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ونعم المولى ونعم النصير. والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على. وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتاب الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا عليكم أنفسكم. صدق الله العلي العظيم. زينوا مجالسكم بالصلوات على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman, Salamun alaikum jamiyan wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Question: how does one know themselves? How does one know themselves? How do I know myself? Keep this question at the forefront in the back of your mind so that we cover this in depth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Ma'idah alludes to a very important reality for you and I. In this discussion, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in this particular verse of the Quran, verse 105, Surah Al-Ma'idah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu alaykum anfusakum. O you who believe, take care of yourselves, take care of your nafs, take care of who you are. This idea being that we have a responsibility due to ourselves to make sure that we are actually protecting ourselves, protecting our souls. Does this necessarily mean physically? Does this necessarily mean that we are protecting ourselves in terms of having a shelter and a roof over our heads, or for example, making sure that no one harms us? Or does this go to perhaps a deeper meaning? Does it have a more in-depth meaning? At other places in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alludes to and tells us very clearly, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu qu anfusakum wa ahlikum nara. O you who believe, protect yourselves and your families from the hellfire, from going to the heaven, to hell. Keeping all of these things in mind, we come to the realization that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us a responsibility. And that responsibility is to take care of our souls and also to take care of our families. When we come to this realization, building on the conversation that we have been having in the last couple of days, and this being the third conversation in that series, about understanding ourselves and understanding our philosophy and how we think, understanding our ethical framework, and also building up and getting to spirituality, the ultimate element that we're trying to strive to. You can imagine this as a pyramid, for example, where you have, for example, the thinking, the framework, how you build your narrative, how you build your belief system, how you build your worldview as the preliminary element of the pyramid. And building on top of that, the ethical framework. That is, once you believe, on top of that, building the ethical framework, that is the traits. What traits do you have? What traits do I have? And for example, generosity, kindness, humility, all of these things would go into that layer. And then the top layer is the final layer, which is spirituality. And that is what we are all searching for in life. That is a greater sense of meaning, a greater sense of purpose, and also a sense of peace and tranquility in our hearts and our minds. Therefore, we were speaking yesterday about this concept of worldview and where do I get my concepts? And we had a conversation into epistemology, into understanding where does my viewpoint come from? Where does my worldview come from? Where does how I think about the world in which I operate and exist, where does that view come from? Philosophers in years past, as I've alluded to in my previous lectures, have said that you tell me the time and space, the zaman and makan, the place and time in which you exist. Do you exist, for example, in China 400 years ago? Well, I can tell you what your thoughts are based on where you live and what time you exist in. Do you live in, for example, in the United States in 2020? Do you live in London in 2020? Do you live in India, for example? Do you live in the Middle East, for example? Give me the time and place, and I'll tell you what you think. This is what philosophers have said. I also alluded to some psychology yesterday about cognitive biases. Cognitive biases such as thinking something is so, but the reality is different. We gave the example of the restaurant. We gave the example of scarcity. We gave the example of false scarcity. There are many other types of biases that you and I have in our mind. In fact, understanding these biases and understanding how our thoughts may not be as clear can help you and I understand where our position is and how we can get to the right place. Not only in this life, but for the hereafter. And not only for the hereafter, but for this life as well. I wanted to share this verse of the Quran because I wanted to share the Quranic and the Islamic motivation behind this conversation about, first and foremost, knowing ourselves. If we know ourselves, we're more inclined to actually get to higher levels of spirituality in our lives. In fact, there are traditions from the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam that I would like to share. The first motivation that I would have discussed is that of the Quran. This is the first level of our analysis today. The next level of analysis that I would like to look at is actually the ahadith, the traditions of Rasulullah, of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. In particular, actually, we're going to look at the traditions of Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen with respect to self-knowledge and how important it is. Then we're going to have a conversation about the position of the science. Where does the science lie on this? And can science actually help us to get to a place in order that we have those traits that actually Islam aspires to? Is there a relationship between science and this conversation or not? And what is that? That's what we're going to cover. These are the main 3 points that we are just going to cover in this conversation today. Therefore, the first part of the conversation that I would like to begin with is the verse that I recited at the very beginning from Surah Al-Ma'idah, referring to Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu alaykum anfusakum. O you who believe, take care of yourselves. Does this mean that I take care of only myself? With respect to answering this, Allama Tabatabai, of course, a student of Allama Qadi, who was someone who was one of the righteous scholars, he actually expounds on this in Tafsir al-Mizan. And he says that it's not necessarily that this is just about taking care of yourself, because you'll find on the path of spirituality that we're trying to endeavor on, that we're on this journey together for, it's not sufficient that I just look after and I care about myself. In fact, you may find that the whole goal is to say that I'm not here. The whole goal is to say that I am in service to others. I am in service to my Lord. And the way I get to serve my Lord is by serving others. And so the idea is it's not just egocentric. It's not just focused on me, this verse. This verse is by virtue, first me taking care of myself and then taking care of others. The example would be for those of us who travel and know that, for example, when the oxygen masks fall, and they always tell you, hopefully you never have to really experience this, but they say that if you're an adult, make sure you put on your oxygen mask before you help others. The idea being that if you haven't taken care of yourself, how can you really help others fully and truly? And in the exact gas or the oxygen mask example, what's happening here is that if you don't have the oxygen on your face, well, you could pass out while you're trying to help someone else. And so this is much akin to the example of the captain and the ship. When the ship is sailing on the seas, that captain needs to make sure that they are in the right place in terms of their mind, so that they are taken care of, so that they can take care of everyone else on the ship. So it's very important that we have a sense of self-protection, self-preservation, self-actualization, so that we can actually, by virtue of that, help other people as well and help society as well. Alama continues on this idea of Amr bil Ma'ruf, for example, that we have this principle of Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy al Munkar, promoting the good and forbidding the evil. And that necessitates that I first, for example, correct myself. And through that process, I also try to help other people. And therefore, if I'm actually following Islam correctly, if I'm actually following Islam appropriately, then I'm actually be following the tenets of Islam that which tell me to actually look after the betterment of society by promoting good and forbidding evil. That's really the philosophy about what we're talking about here. So it's not egocentric, it's actually focused on bettering yourself, so you can better your family, so you can better your community, so you can better your society at large. This is with respect to the Quranic motivation. With respect to the ahadith, and looking at what the ahadith of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam have told us with respect to this reality, we come to some very important traditions. I mentioned the previous conversation about the very famous tradition about man araf fanafsa arafa rabba. The one who understands themselves understands their Lord. But I want to share some traditions from Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen on this topic, where Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen has gone further and said, for example, number one, that the ultimate knowledge is self-knowledge. The ultimate knowledge in terms of Islam, the ultimate ilm, is actually understanding themselves, understanding ourselves. So this is something that needs to be examined. If Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen is saying, Babi Madinatul Ilm is saying that the one who learned everything from Rasulullah, and this gate of knowledge is telling us that the height of knowledge, the epitome of knowledge, the highest level of knowledge is actually understanding ourselves. And why wouldn't be in light of the previous tradition? The previous tradition stating that one who understands themselves understands their Lord. Amir al-Mu'mineen, he continues and he gives a beautiful example. He says, I'm astonished, I'm shocked at the one who loses something and immediately is in an urgency to try to find that thing. But he has lost his soul and he's not in urgency to find his soul. What a profound tradition of Amir al-Mu'mineen in this light. Where he's saying, I'm astonished, the person who loses something, they drop something, you lost your keys, you lost your phone. Imagine in today's day and era, someone forgets their phone or loses their phone. It's as if you've lost a limb for some people. You've lost this part of you, for example. He says, I'm astonished at the person who loses something and is so urgent to find that thing that they've lost. But you've lost your soul and you have no urgency to find that soul. Where it is? Where is it? You know, I say this because we have to be very careful about where our society may lead us. If it's good, that's wonderful. But we should be able to deduce what is right, what is wrong, through Islamic tenets and through clear philosophical thinking. What do I mean? What I mean here is, for example, we think that everyone must have, for example, a cell phone. We think that in today's day and era, I'm giving an example of a cell phone. Can you imagine life without a cell phone? For example, can you imagine life without a smartphone, a phone which has all of the features, for example, of apps and, for example, the videos and all of the things that go with that, organizing and all of these things, Google Maps, things of that nature. All of these things that are very helpful and very beneficial in society. Now, if someone doesn't have a cell phone in today's era, it is seen as if something that is abnormal. It is seen as something that is out of the norm. I want to give you a worldly practical example. For instance, you all know Harari. Now, remember I mentioned a worldview. This person, like you and I, has a way that they see the world. They come from a particular background. They may be agnostic, they may be atheistic in the way they view the world. They may have a particular viewpoint. Giving one example from an individual is not something that condones all necessary actions of that individual. Across the board, this should be noted. But the example that I'm giving is pertinent. Why? This individual who's written this book called Sapiens, and he's written this, and he's basically lived his life in a way that is very different to what you and I may be living. For example, this person has one cell phone that is not a smartphone, it's a flip phone, it's a phone that's more traditional. and they live on a farm and they're very remote and not very accessible. This is someone who is able to look at the world from a different view. Malcolm Gladwell, a very famous writer. In fact, when he was asked about this, the first author example I gave was Yuval Noah Harari, a researcher, historian. I'm giving the example of Malcolm Gladwell. These are people who are going against the drift of society. So what did Malcolm Gladwell say? Malcolm Gladwell was asked, how does he come up with these amazing insights in order to write books such as Blink and Outliers and David and Goliath and Talking to Strangers and all these bestsellers? And he's someone who writes about sociology in our world and our culture and our society. And he said, when I want to do something or take a project to write a book, I look at what society is doing and I go in the completely opposite direction. He said, what do you mean by that? What are you saying? What are you referring to when you say this? He says that, well, look, I noticed that people are on their phones more. I've noticed that people are on their digital devices more. Although they have benefit, when I see people on their phones, I go towards the library. I go to places where people are not going to anymore, where people used to go where they aren't anymore. He says, so I get a lot of insights from books. So he says, for example, the internet emerged in the public domain, at least in the 90s. But before that, there was a lot of knowledge. And although much of it has actually been transcribed and is in the digital sphere, there's a lot of that knowledge that is not available in the digital sphere. And it's only in books. You think about many of our religious texts, our manuscripts. I remember when I had the opportunity and the honor to actually visit the holy city of Najaf al-Ashraf. May Allah grant us all the ziyarah of Najaf al-Ashraf, that holy city. And we were able to visit some of the libraries, the Hakim Library and other libraries, where there were rare manuscripts that are one-time or one-form versions of books that have been written by scholars. And some of these have, alhamdulillah, by the work of some people who are very dedicated, have actually been made digitized. But there's a lot of other material, a lot of other things that, for example, we may not have there. Malcolm Gladwell says, I find that knowledge in books, in old newspapers, things of this nature that aren't as readily accessible. And so sometimes we realize that if we want to think differently, if we want to think outside the box, we actually have to go outside the box and do things that other people are not doing. Everything that society does is not necessarily the right thing. There's many opportunities for improvement. In fact, popular opinion, we have to be very careful and very skeptical of at times. In fact, Plato, in his Republic, argued that he was against democracy in the form that you and I see today in the world, because he said that democracy everywhere becomes mob rule. I'm not here to make a political point in any particular countries or anything of this nature. What I'm getting at is the philosophy or the political philosophy behind what was meant to be. He argued that it's unfair and unjust to have this where people are making decisions in the sense of traditional democracy. Even Winston Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government, except everything else has been tried. I'm not against democracy. I'm making another point here. Please be careful about what point I'm driving at. Plato said that we should have philosopher kings, people who, for example, are individuals who have the absolute power, they have the power of kings, total power, but they're also philosophers. They're logical people who are rational and have virtue. And he said that person who has virtue and power should be ruling. And he believed in aristocracy, which was intellectual in nature. We today think of aristocracy in the form of financial or economic versions of it. He was talking about the people who are smartest in society should be ruling society. Why? Because imagine for a moment that somebody is an economist, and somebody who's an economist is being asked to make a decision, for example, on medical policy. For example, the COVID-19 crisis that we're facing today. If you ask the top economist in the world, what should we do with respect to opening up the country and closing the countries and things of this nature? Is it fair to ask that person about that matter? They're an expert, but they're an expert in what? In economics. They may not be an expert, for example, in viruses. So why would we ask that person who's an economist to make a decision on the medical policy? And vice versa. If you have somebody who's an expert in medical policy, in, for example, infectious diseases, would you ask that person about medical, for example, economic policy? He said, but we do this every single day in democracies, whether we realize it or not. So he said, for example, we have people assess who are not experts in a field about what we should do for society. And we do this because we don't necessarily have a better solution. And so we need to be skeptical and just think and reflect, not necessarily saying that everything's wrong, but just pause and reflect. Why do I think the way I do? Why do I believe what I do? Why are all of these thoughts coming in my mind? Is it because this has been instilled by society upon me? Or do I truly believe this through clear, rational thinking? Amir al-Mu'mineen says that I'm astonished and I'm baffled at the person who has lost something and is in an urgent rush to find that thing. But you've lost your soul and you're not in a hurry to find that. And sometimes it's not just this, it's where you're looking, where you're trying to find your soul, where you're trying to find it. There's the old adage, it's been attributed to many people in science today and in academia, it's called the streetlight effect. And this idea that has been attributed also to people like Mullah Nasiruddin and others in history, that a man is in the street in the night. And when he's in the street in the night, he's walking down the street and he's under a street lamp. And when he's under the street lamp, he's looking and he's on his hands and knees and he's looking for things. When he's looking for things on his hands and knees, and he begins to try to find things, passers-by pass by and say, "What are you looking for?" And at that point in time, he says that, "I'm looking for my keys. I've lost my keys. I've dropped them." And they say, the natural question that emerges that, "Well, where did you leave your keys last? Where were they? Where were your keys?" And he said that, "My keys were in the house." And they're astonished. And they ask, "Your keys are in the house and you're searching in the street for your keys? How does that make sense?" He stops and says, "Well, this is where the light is. That's why I'm searching here." And at that point in time, you come to this realization that we may be looking for the thing that we've lost in the wrong places. What does that mean? That our peace and our tranquility that we're searching for in our lives, we may be looking and searching for them in external things, in external validation, such as, I think if I get money one day, therefore I'll automatically be happy. If I get a car one day, I'll automatically be happy, such and such car. If I get such and such a house, for example, I will automatically be happy. If I do anything material externally, or I have societal prestige, I'm trying to make my neighbors happy. I'm trying to make my community happy. Oh, look, so and so, so and so walked by. Look, did you see his house? Did you see his car? Did you see what he's accumulated? Do you see his prestige? Do you see his income? And I'm trying to seek contentment and happiness in external validation, whereas happiness actually and tranquility and peace of mind actually lies inside of me. It's like the home and the streetlight example. That individual dropped their keys have been dropped inside the house, inside the home, inside the soul, and they're searching outside in the street for tranquility and peace. This is much like what we're facing in our world today, a world where we're trying to get peace of mind, but we have filled our hearts so much with what is called, according to our scholars, hubb dunya, this love of the world. Not in the sense of, for example, saying the beauty of the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not that type of love of the world. We're talking about that love that fills the heart to the point that we're constantly enamored by the material world. How is it possible that I'm constantly after the material world and I'm seeking spirituality, which is part and parcel of the immaterial world? That world that comes from the heart and the mind, the soul. That's what I'm striving for. That's where the spirituality comes from. And if the spirituality comes from there, and I'm constantly have all my attention in my life on simply the material, then how can I have this spirituality? It's a catch-22. It's a dilemma. I'm not saying by any means to not go after the material. Get the education. I'm part of this system myself of academia, of education and bettering oneself. Get the job. Do the work. No problem. In fact, see that as part of your faith. See that as part of your deen. I say this coming to the final part of the conversation with respect to the science. We live in interesting times. I mentioned this paradigm of philosophy, ethics, and spirituality for a particular reason. Keeping the end in mind, or beginning with the end in mind, which is the ultimate goal that we're trying to get, is spirituality, peace, tranquility in our minds and our hearts. There are certain ethical practices that our scholars, our righteous scholars, have recommended for you and I to adopt in our lives so that we can actually get spirituality as a byproduct of it, as a result of it. What are some of those traits? Some of those traits are, for example, austerity, for example, living a aesthetic life, a life where I'm not constantly always material. For example, having steadfastness, for example, having determination, these are recommended by the scholars. Having resilience, for example, these are recommended by the scholars. And fasting and other things. We'll get to some of those traits that the scholars have talked about in subsequent lectures. But I wanted to share with you, we live in very interesting times. Why? Because the science of our world is now coming forward and saying that it's very possible that some of these very traits that have been recommended by scholars of Islam in light of the Ahlul Bayt and in light of the Quran al-Majid, that it's very possible that those traits that have been recommended are actually the scientific prescription for happiness in our lives. Two, the scientists, of course, not necessarily focused on the religious dialogue, in their own research have found that some of these traits that happen to be the traits that were being recommended by scholars for years are actually the traits that help us. What do I mean? If you go back to the 1960s or before in the world of psychology, that is the study of the human mind, when you go back, you will find that there were two main domains of psychology roughly 50 years ago. What were those two domains? The first was psychoanalysis and the other was behavioralism. Bear with me on this important point. Psychoanalysis was looking at trying to have people reflect on their depression, their anxiety, their worries, their concerns, their phobias, and trying to make them reflect upon them, and so that they are able to treat the negative symptoms that they may be experiencing. Behavioralism, similarly. The whole focus of psychology before 50 years ago was underwater. That is, looking at the negative aspects. How can we minimize the negative aspects of life so that people's suffering is diminished or mitigated or reduced? So people's suffering is reduced. In 1964 and beyond, research spearheaded by individuals at the University of Pennsylvania and other researchers began to say, why is it that we're just trying to make someone who's in a negative loss come to zero only? That is, why is our conversation about psychology half-baked? Why is it only halfway analyzed? And they said, what do you mean? They said, well, we're looking at people who are suffering mentally, and we're trying to make them whole again. But we're not looking at a huge other part of the equation. They said, what's the other part of the equation? The other part of the equation, they said, is how do you make someone from zero go to 1, 2, 3 towards 100? We're taking someone from negative 100 to zero. We're trying to get them there. But what about the other side of the equation? Actually giving people positive traits so they can have a positive sense of fulfillment and well-being in life. They can actually be tranquil and happy in life. This is what is now called positive psychology. Well, the problem that existed for a long time was people said, well, how do you measure that? How do you measure happiness? How do you statistically and data-wise analyze someone's happiness and tranquility and peace of mind? And they've found a metric system that actually allows us to assess our happiness, which is an acronym. PEMRA is the acronym, which includes certain traits such as engagement in life. How engaged are you with others? Your relationships in life. Do you have good relationships in your life or not? And other different metrics. Family, like, is family important to you? Do you have these relationships built in? Do you have peace of mind? And many other things. Do you have a passion for life? Things of this nature. And what I want to get at is some of these traits that have been recommended to us, such as a big one that will come up, is the trait of resilience. That is, when I suffer, how do I bounce back? When I suffer, how do I come back? This is part and parcel of what the scholars have described as steadfastness or devotion and dedication, resilience on this path towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We may very well be hit with difficult times, but are we resilient? The science shows that resilience is one of the most important traits in order to actually live a positive life, a fulfilling life, a virtuous life. I say this because before 50 years ago, science didn't know how to study a good life. They didn't know how to study a virtuous life. And when you read the writings of our scholars, they allude to living a good life. But what is a good life? A good life is a life of virtue. A life of virtue in light of the Quran and the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. To do good to oneself, to do good to one's family, to do good to one's community, and at large to do good to one's society and nation by virtue of that. To live the good life, the virtuous life, as the Imams alayhimus salam alluded to. And when asked about this in writings, in a conversation between Rasulullah and Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, Rasulullah tells Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen to write. And at that moment, Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen says, Ya Rasulullah, what shall I write? And he says, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And then he says, for example, adopt faith. Faith, but what is faith? He says that faith is not simply believing, although belief is the first pillar. You believe and you also show it through your actions. And that's the essence of what we're driving at, what we're getting at is have clear thinking, have clear intent and niyat, and show it by that's in the philosophical framework, and show that by means of the ethics that we adopt, our actions. When we have this clear thinking, good niyyah, good intentions combined with ethics, we will ultimately, as a result, on the journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, get spirituality in our lives. But I shared the scientific perspective because it's not that you'll just get peace of mind in the akhirah, in the hereafter. You will begin to see the dividends and the benefits of following the spiritual path in your life, because we live in an amazing time. We live in a time where the science is beginning to show us the benefits of religious practices. And if you and I don't adopt a worldview that includes the religious perspective, we may undermine the entire spirituality and the spiritual framework that can actually help us get to peace of mind, tranquility, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ultimately, it helps us get there much faster. So the point being, and what the main point that we've addressed here is, the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the Quran has told us that we must try to protect ourselves. Alaykum anfusakum, protect yourselves. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through the teachings of Amir al-Mu'mineen and the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, has said the height of knowledge is self-knowledge. And furthermore, astonishing is the fact that there is a person who has lost something and searching for it in urgency, but they've lost their soul and are not searching for their soul. How is mankind so oblivious to the soul? And the final element being the science that's showing us that we have tremendous benefits for these things that have been prescribed by the scholars. But it requires a worldview where we don't simply undermine the religious doctrine, because spirituality by definition is not necessarily, at this point in time, the way we're looking at it, it's not fully in the material world. These are two worlds at odds. But today, we're living in a world where we're actually being able to bridge these. If you're looking for spirituality, one of the first steps that the mystics and the spiritual guides of Islam, of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, the scholars such as Allama Tabatabai, Allama Qadi, they recommend the first trait is to renounce customs that don't make sense, norms of society that don't make sense, to renounce those. That doesn't mean don't abide by the laws of your land. You must, and we must abide by all the laws of the land. We're not talking about that here. What we're referring to and what we're talking about here is, if society says keep up with the Joneses, I pause and I stop and I reflect, do I necessarily have to do that in my life? And I try to go in another direction. If, for example, society says the only basis of your success is, by the way, what philosophers have called the quintessential question of the 20th century, they're not saying it's right, they're just saying this is what it is that the quintessential question of the 20th and the 21st century is, when you meet someone, you ask them, what do you do? And this concept and this idea of judging someone's entire life based on one dimension of their life, this is not necessarily right. And this is not necessarily virtuous. Why? Because we judge people based on today on their profession. And that doesn't necessarily tell you if they're a good person or a bad person. That's one dimension of this person, whereas may have many dimensions. I say this because we take people who, for example, are famous, who have fame and fortune, and we put them on a pedestal. But many times in society, we don't stop and pause and reflect. Well, how did this person become rich and famous? How did they get this? Is this even a noble pursuit or not? Pause and stop and reflect on that. And don't simply go where the drift of society takes us. Rather, go much further.
Please remember this analogy of the drift. It will come again and again in our lecture series, and we'll return to it. Don't simply go with the drift of society. Each society has a drift. And I will expound on what the concept of a drift is in subsequent lectures. I hope this conversation has been of benefit to you, inshallah, and I hope we're able to implement some of the discussion that we've had today, inshallah. Wa akhiru da'wana an alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala ashraf al-anbiya wal mursaleen. Allahumma salli Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad.